And what we have currently is the de-escalation as it relates to force. Well, we're looking at disengaging, because what we've taught our law enforcement officers over the years is to de-escalate the situation. Well, we need to also change the conversation that there are alternative solutions, and it is okay to disengage a volatile situation in order to get the kind of outcomes that we need for our agency and our community. So we're looking at all of our training. We're looking at making sure that racial bias, implicit bias, multiculturalism, those things are not just taught on the inside of our organization, but looking at community and philanthropic and business leaders who've gotten this right in some instances, to come in and look at our agency and teach from that perspective with a service mind, so that we can look at policing very differently. 21st century policing has been the forefront of not only my leadership, but multiple police chiefs across this country. And we're continuing to push that envelope. This is the time to change. Real change can come out of where we are currently, and it is our opportunity to do so. And I know that here in Dallas, we're going to be that model for all the change that needs to be made in this country.
Back on the topic of qualified immunity, Vanita, you said recently in a CNN interview that ending qualified immunity is critical. So should ending qualified immunity and banning no-knock warrants be adopted as part of the Democratic Party's national platform at the convention?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Democratic Party platform, I would hope that the Republican Party platform, but obviously being realistic, should adopt the provisions that are in the Justice and Policing Act. Those are provisions that have been studied. The Leadership Conference put an accountability framework together and sent it to every member of Congress on June 1st. And we were so pleased to work with Chairwoman Bass and the Congressional Black Caucus to help shape the contents of the Justice and Policing Act out of years of informed work, both from what I was bringing from the Justice Department and all of the pattern and practice investigations, but also the moment that we're in. And as somebody said, this is a moment where some things that were conceived of as, unthinkable for Congress 5 weeks ago are very much possible in this moment. These are all provisions, and I want to emphasize this, that DOJ consent decrees advocated for in a number of jurisdictions that had long histories of systemic misconduct, bans on no-knock warrants for drug offenses, using more of a necessary standard, the kind of training that Chief Hall is talking about around de-escalation, duty to intervene. We know, though, that on these issues, you can have policies, you need training, but ultimately, culture will eat policy for lunch. And this is a moment where there really is the possibility of transformational change in the culture of policing. It requires police reform, but it also requires looking at the ways in which Black communities and Brown communities have skewed resources, an overinvestment in purely kind of exclusive money around criminal legal systems that have also, in these communities, have also seen a longstanding divestment in housing, jobs, infrastructure. In places like Baltimore, when the Justice Department went in, policing problems were often the tip of the spear. And so this is a moment for a holistic view on these issues. And that's what's different, I think, about the moment we find ourselves in. It's happening against a backdrop of a global pandemic that is also highlighting so much of these structural inequalities that themselves out on the basis of race. And so we have to acknowledge that and reckon with that in this moment.
Very briefly, Chief Hall, I think you earlier wanted to chime in on the issue of ending qualified immunity. Do you support it, or what are your considerations there?
The issue of qualified immunity will be debated heavily, as it should. I only have one question. Who is going to do this job? Who is going to stay in this noble profession of policing if they have to worry about whether or not they specifically are going to lose their homes or their kids' college tuition? And we're not discussing individuals who have blatant disrespect for proper procedure. Those individuals who blatantly break the law and the rules of an organization. qualified immunity should not be afforded to those individuals. But the individuals who go out each and every day and attempt to do the right thing. I'm a spiritual person, so I'll take it biblically. The Bible tells us that on our best or at our best, we're equal to a filthy rag. So even in those instances where officers are putting forth their best effort and they get it wrong, if they're looking at a bankruptcy or a homes being taken away from them or their lives being disrupted, my question is, who does this job? And it's difficult already in law enforcement. I know this could be debated, but I think we have to continue to remember that this is a noble profession and we want individuals. Right now, we have the opportunity to bring in individuals in law enforcement who can change the trajectory of it, who have a different mindset, that we can create new cultures of law enforcement. I think we really need to make sure that those questions are answered. And again, this issue would be debated heavily as it should, but that is my question.
People,
I think what I hear.
Yeah, if you would like to, sorry, Vanita, did you want to say something?
Really quickly, you know, in any qualified immunity would not place officers' kind of own purse books on the line. Most police departments and police officers are indemnified by insurance companies. What it does do, though, is actually ensure that there is accountability and greater accountability in the system, both in civil cases and, as the Justice and Policing Act does, expands the criminal prosecutorial reach of the Justice Department to reach more cases of police misconduct. It will only increase the legitimacy of policing in these communities where for too long people have thought that bad actors and systemic problems in police departments are going unaccounted for. And that is why there's been this wide sweeping call to end qualified immunity that has shielded officers from liability.
Secretary Castro, something that has been a part of this kind of new revitalized conversation around police reform, and you kind of mentioned it at the beginning, is the strength of police unions. Do you think that police unions are a barrier to meaningful police reform? And if so, what can be done to shift those power dynamics?
Oh, I mean, there's no question that they've been a barrier to meaningful police reform. And I mean, let's also be honest that it works two ways, right? I mean, they've exerted tremendous political influence on mayors, city councils, others in public office who have entered into police contracts that establish policies that essentially allow bad actors to get away with their bad actions, and also create this culture that we're talking about that has become toxic. Maybe one of the best examples of this was the gentleman in Buffalo, the 75-year-old elderly man who was pushed to the ground and started bleeding out and very seriously injured. The two officers that were disciplined for that, the union folks applauded them. And I think 57 people who served in that unit said that they no longer wanted to serve in that unit because those officers were being disciplined. Those union contracts absolutely need to be changed. I don't believe that police unions should have a role in bargaining for officer discipline or accountability or transparency measures. I believe that we would be better off if they did not have that role. I also believe that people in elective office need to stand up and be more willing to go against the wishes of the police union. They're making contributions to campaigns. They're sending people out to block, walk, and canvass in campaigns. Obviously, they're voting in municipal elections, and their household is voting in municipal elections that have very low turnouts. And so the perception is created that, hey, if you don't do what the police union wants, it's going to be harder to get reelected. At base, the politicians sitting in those seats need to be able to go against them, and summon the wherewithal to do it. Now is the moment to do that because the tide has changed. I also think that the state can help out a lot. Oftentimes, bad provisions within these union contracts are mirrored in state law. For instance, very quickly in Texas, in San Antonio, the union contract still says right now that if an officer is terminated, for instance, they can appeal that, and that goes to an arbitrator. Right. Oftentimes these arbitrators kind of split the baby and they say, well, we're not going to terminate this officer for the horrendous thing they did. We're just going to suspend them for 15 days or 30 days or whatever it is. But that officer still gets to keep his or her job, despite the fact that they shouldn't be on the force. That provision is actually part of state law as well. So you have to undo that in the union contract, and then you got to go fight in the state capitol to undo it in state law too.
Thank you.
Let me give you another, yes.
Representative Bass, how is the considerable influence of police unions impacting congressional negotiations? And we're kind of running up on time here, so if you could answer that quickly.
Yes, and can you hear me okay? I know there are problems with my audio. Okay. Well, first of all, I don't think that they are impacting our negotiations. I do think that that happens a lot in the state and on the local level. But, you know, in addition to the unions, we also have to deal with the police officers' Bill of Rights. So one of the things that I believe has happened because of the massive protests, but also because of the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, is that it has encouraged states and local governments to act. And that's one of the things that happens when there is, you know, the federal initiative. You know, in addition to what Secretary Castro was talking about in terms of the arbitration, you know, the officer that killed George Floyd, he's still eligible for his pension. You know, in upstate New York, who intervened when one of her colleagues was choking someone out and she was afraid that that person was going to die. She intervened, she stopped the chokehold, she got fired. The union didn't protect her. And so as Vanita and other people have been saying, we are really hoping that this transformative legislation begins it serves as a catalyst to challenge and to change police culture. I believe
Congresswoman Bass, thank you. Congresswoman Bass, I'm sorry, I do have to cut you off. We are running up on time and we want to get to one or two audience questions for you guys. First, to Chief Hall, very quickly, one of the leading demands of the Black Lives Matter movement is to defund the police. You've denounced it, but do you think that less should be spent on police departments and that some of the budget could be reallocated to services like mental health or education? And if you could just briefly answer that, thank you. Chief Hall, you're muted.
I apologize. I do believe that there's room for the community and or service industry to do some of the things that police departments are asked to do. I will say over and over again, we're asked to do too much. We asked for mental illness. We need to take care of the mentally ill. We have to take care of homelessness and all of those social ills that we are not equipped to do. So I do believe that there is room for us as a city to expend monies in those areas and get those services that the community actually needs. But when we talk about defunding the police department, we are denying the residents of our communities the right to safety and protection. And I think those are the things that we have to take into consideration, that there is a responsibility of the police to keep communities safe. Can that expand to other services and other community organizations within a city that is a collaborative effort? Absolutely. But the need for police, it cannot be ignored, that the communities need law enforcement. If we just look at our crime rates, we need law enforcement.
Thank you. And then we have some questions from the audience. So this is a question for all of our panelists. This is one from our viewers, and they want to know, will the issue of police reform disappear the way gun control was stalled in response to mass shootings? So Congresswoman Bass, I'll start with you.
Well, it most certainly will not disappear. This is something I've worked on for over 4 decades, so I'm not hardly going to stop now, especially when we have this moment where transformative change is possible. But we have to push, we have to keep pushing, and I'm ready to do that.
And then Vanita, would you please address the question as well?
I think that's absolutely right. And unfortunately, George Floyd's killing won't be the last. And we have to be really clear about the need to re-envision public safety, to bring in other parts of our communities into helping to shape what public safety looks like, and not relying exclusively on kind of a criminal legal response. But there's no question that Police reform, these issues around policing and public safety and racial justice have been at the seeding and founding of our country. This is a moment to engage in transformative change at the local, state, and federal level, and these issues are not going away.
Chief Hall, do you think that the issue of police reform will disappear and stall?
I don't think it will, and I don't think it should. There is a need for change in law enforcement. Most of us have known this for many years. It's the reason why 21st century policing was introduced, and most police chiefs, myself included, is pushing that 21st century policing that builds trust and legitimacy and changes how we do it. Culture is a huge issue in all of our agencies, and so we recognize from whence policing came, how it was established, and where we were as a country, not only 53, 60 years ago in Jim Crow. So we know that there is a need for reform and change. And I can tell you that the Dallas Police Department is up for that change. We're working alongside of our community leaders, as well as any other individuals who want to have a seat at the table to let us know what it is that we need to do differently in order for us to be that legitimate entity that the people can trust.
Secretary Castro, same question.
I don't think it is going to go back to the way that it was. First of all, these videos are going to keep coming out. Everybody has a cell phone camera. There are body cams as well. In municipalities across this country, people are running for DA that want to make significant changes. There are police chiefs and mayors and city councils that want to do that. Congress has acted. And so I think that what's going to happen is that you're going to have a continued stronger push than there has been. Will it be as passionate as it is in this moment? Look, I mean, I think that is going to come, unfortunately, in association with incidents that we see. But I don't think that we're going back. I don't think that we're going back. I think that in a lot of cities today, if you took a vote, or a year from now, if you took a vote, for instance, as to whether police should have the ability to collectively bargain, because of the political dynamics of essentially progressives and Democrats turning on that idea, and Republicans who traditionally do not have much affinity for unions, I think that there's a good shot in a lot of cities that they would lose. And that's just one example of how things have changed. The political dynamics around policing have shifted for folks that are trying to defend the old system, and it's not going backward.
Thank you everyone for joining us. That is all the time that we have, and we covered a lot of topics. That is part one of our town hall, America at a Tipping Point. Thank you to our guests for an illuminating conversation about this moment and police policies that are being addressed by Congress and local entities. As we said at the top, we wanted to hear from you. So here are some of our audience responses to our question about what you think is the most critical change that needs to be made in criminal justice and policing. And some of the answers covered ending qualified immunity, dissolving police unions, as well as reallocating resources to other services such as education and healthcare. Thank you, everyone.
I will be sticking around for a second discussion, a breakthrough in the national conversation. What now? I'll be joined by my colleague Ryan Lizza, Chief Washington Correspondent at Politico. We'll explore the shift in national discourse about racism and what actions could follow. See you guys there. Hi again, told you I'd be back. My name is Eugene Daniels. I am a video reporter at Politico for those who missed the first half. I'm joined now by my colleague, Ryan Lizza. He is our Chief Washington Correspondent. We're co-hosting this Politico Live Town Hall, America at a Tipping Point, to reflect on what's been happening around the country a month after the killing of George Floyd while being restrained by police.
Hey everyone, I'm Ryan Lizza. In this conversation, we're going to explore the recent shift in how Americans are talking about race and how that change could translate into long-term change in American society and across all areas of American life, and not just policing and criminal justice. So we really want to expand this conversation beyond some of the policy that we talked about in the first session. We have three fantastic people with us here today to talk about this. Maurice Mitchell, who is a strategist for the Movement for Black Lives. Rashad Robinson, a civil rights leader and president of Color of Change. And Lisa Cylar Barrett, the director of policy at the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Thank you, all three of you, for being with us. And go ahead, Eugene, I think you're going to say something before we start.
I do. Before we get started and dig into these issues, this is a virtual town hall. So like before, we want to hear from all of you watching. What has encouraged you the most in recent weeks about how the US is tackling racism and race relations? You can type your answer under the live stream on politico.com, where there's a little text box. At the end of our conversation, we'll share some of those responses. We also open it up for audience questions at the end. You can submit those questions by tweeting @PoliticoLive with the hashtag #PoliticalTownHall.
All right, let's get started. Lisa, I would like to begin with you. You work on policy and have worked on some of the nitty-gritty legislative issues for a long time now. And can you just give us a sort of overview of how the Washington policy landscape, or if you want to talk about state capitals, but just in general, how the policy landscape has shifted in recent weeks in terms of the issues you work on? And I really want our viewers to understand what legislation is now in the realm of possibility when it comes to police reform or economic racial justice that just a month ago was not even being talked about. Just give us a sense of the shift on the issues that you work on.
Sure, and thank you, Ryan and Politico, for having this important conversation. And the conversation before was great. So I think you've seen over the last few weeks tremendous movement in terms of introduction of legislation around policing reform, and not just legislation, well, in some instances, not just legislation for the sake of being able to say that you've done something, but legislation that actually embodies the accountability framework that many of us here in DC and the advocates across the country have been pushing for a number of years in terms of ensuring that there's an accountability framework for police misconduct. And so you've seen strong support for that, particularly in the House. I think in the Senate, there's a realization that something has to be done. But I think as you saw with the legislation that was introduced by the Republicans on that side, what was introduced, we would consider to be nibbling around the edges and not even close to the accountability framework that's needed, which is why we supported not advancing that legislation. And we're now pushing for the Senate to take up the Justice in Policing Act. So I think what is happening is a recognition that something has to be done, that the country is not going to settle for sort of piecemeal, neutral kind of legislation that we've seen before. And we will see what happens on the Senate side. So unfortunately, we are still seeing very partisan dealing with this issue. But I think the unrest that you continue to see across the country, the vocalization folks in districts all over continues to keep that pressure on the Senate, and hopefully we will see some movement there. With regard to other legislation, unfortunately, we're not seeing anything move in the Senate. The House has been very active in terms of passing needed legislation and bills to fix and address some of the issues that are underlying and causing some of this systemic racism that underbeds the unrest that we're seeing. But unfortunately, they are dying as they go over to the Senate. The Senate has been squarely focused on confirming judicial nominees and not addressing some of the critical legislation that's needed, including the HEROES Act, which would help address some of the economic and health issues that we're seeing with COVID.
Rashad, this fight for racial justice is old as this nation. Fast forward 400 years, and it's so complex, it's entrenched in everything that we do. And it feels like it's going to take a change in policy and culture and behavior and mindsets. And that has to happen at every level in society. And I think what I hear from people sometimes that it makes them feel hopeless, too daunting maybe, but it feels like a real tipping point now. So what is it going to take to make sure this doesn't just become another moment that America kind of just moves on from?
So a couple of things. First of all, thanks for having me. I think a couple of things are really important here. First is that a deep recognition that people don't experience issues, they experience life. That the forces that hold us back are deeply interrelated, that a racist criminal justice system requires a racist media culture to keep it alive and survive and keep demand for that certain type of policing, that economic inequality goes hand in hand with political inequality. So as much as we can have a lot of conversations about policy ideas and about the things that we want to move, we have to recognize that this is not simply about power. In fact, about policy, it's about power. And because it's about power, we actually have to do the work to build power, both around the ideas that we want to move and the people that we want to make more powerful in our society. And that has to be the work of racial justice, because we're not going to policy ourselves out of this problem, right? It's already illegal to kill unarmed Black people. Let me say that one more time. It's already illegal to kill unarmed Black people. And so coming to the movement constantly saying, well, what are your policy demands to fix the fact that unarmed Black people are being killed? I want to make sure that we are in the conversation around power because, right, there are so many different forces that keep these systems in place, right? For the last 20 years in this country, violent crime has basically steadily went down, while at the same time, we've seen policing budgets go up. We have seen the police departments become more militarized. We have seen Pew Research study after study each year believing that Americans actually believe violent crime is going up while it's actually going down. So we have gaps between perception and reality that are creating demands. We have gaps around what people think the priority should be in our country and where money should go. And to actually get to then racial justice means that we have to create a new set of power. And so the thing I will say about all of this is that none of us should mistake presence for power. And what I mean by that is that we are in a moment of deep visibility, awareness, retweets, front page news stories, sessions like this, where people are having these conversations. But when we mistake presence and visibility for power, and power being the ability to change the rules, we think that we've done something that we haven't actually had. We think the conversation alone means that we've moved ourselves forward. We mistake a Black president for thinking that we are actually post-racial. We think that America having a lot of pop stars and pop celebrities that are Black, that they love, means that America loves Black people as much as America loves Black culture. And America can love Black culture and hate Black people at the same time. And so all of this is about, from a rules perspective, changing both written and unwritten rules. And that is the power of movements, to both welcome new people into an effort to both create the demand for new ways of change, and then to put people in office or get people out of office that can make those changes happen. And to do that cycle over cycle is the work that movements have to do. And for the last 7 years in this country, the growing movement for Black lives, the movement of everyday people that has grown new organizations, that has grown new infrastructure, has been part of getting us to this moment. And unfortunately, that's been the tragic situations, the tragic moments, which have oftentimes animated people's energy. But none of us should make no mistake about the fact that it's been infrastructure and activists and leaders and folks on the ground and communities around the country, which have been able to channel this into the type of demands that have been reducing police budgets now, that have been holding police unions accountable, and that have been pushing for the type of changes that are beyond the sort of short-sighted fake solutions to real problems like banning chokeholds, which we know don't actually get us to a different type of reality of safety and justice.
That's actually a great segue into what I was going to ask Maurice. So Maurice, just sort of picking up from where Rashad was, what he was talking about, you and I recently talked about the relationship between protest and policy, between people in the streets and people in the halls of power. And I know this is something that you think a lot about. And I wonder if you could just critique this movement a little bit and tell us, from the perspective of a strategist who wants the movement to be as powerful and sort of guided and goal-oriented, I assume. What is this movement doing well, moving politicians closer to its agenda? And what would you like to see it improved upon? And maybe you could also just say a few words historically, what movements you look to for sort of guidance and inspiration, and what movements you've either been a part of or historically that have been promising but ended up failures, just to sort of get a sense of where this thing is going right now.
Sure, and it's a pleasure to be here, Ryan and Eugene, and an honor always to sit with you, Rashad and Lisa. So the way I would respond to that question, number one, social movements are at their most effective when they render the invisible visible. What do I mean by that? Social movements surface questions, lift up contradictions in our society that we've just grown so accustomed to that they're rendered invisible to sort of dominant society. Social movements, when they're effective, they show a mirror to our society so that we could see ourselves, and then we could address those issues. And the other thing that social movements do when they're effective is that they render the impossible possible. What do I mean by that? There are millions of people who continue to hit the streets during a time when there's a global pandemic, calling for freedom, calling for Black freedom. And there's a Black-led movement for Black lives that on the streets is intergenerational and multiracial and cross-sector in its character. That is tremendous. So from the standpoint of the fundamentals and the strength of the movement, this movement is strong. The scale of the movement is undeniable. And recent opinion polls show that the movement is penetrating and it's working. So 95% of people agree at this point that some form of police reform must happen. 74% of people agree that the violent torture murder of George Floyd is directly related to systemic racism, right? Not just like the fact that some individual cop was a bad person, but that was a direct result of systemic racism. And then after the heat of the first weeks of the protests, majorities of people, 74% of people agreed that the basic premise and the direction of the protest was just. So that includes a lot of white folks, that includes some independents, some Republicans agreeing that the movement is just. So we've certainly reached a tipping point. The thing I would say is that I think we're in a moment where we're being called upon for significant transformational change. And there's a number of factors that are conspiring. I think the fact that we're months into COVID-19 and we've experienced a complete collapse of all of our systems. It's like we're in the eye of multiple storms. So we have the COVID-19 storm. We have this storm, the reckoning around our history around anti-Black racism, right? And so that creates an opportunity for us to do big things. You asked about the historical question. Reconstruction didn't come out of nowhere. Reconstruction was a response to a deep national trauma where hundreds of thousands of people lost their lives. The New Deal didn't come out of nowhere. It was in response to the Great Depression. We're similarly situated in history, where we have to respond to a global depression where we're experiencing, and Black people are experiencing all these things acutely. We're 13% of the population, 30% of the deaths due to COVID-19. We're generally, whatever is the median sort of unemployment numbers, we're generally doubling those things. So the fact that we're experiencing depression level unemployment and we're seeing, bread lines that are hours long, we know that Black people are feeling that acutely. And so what is required in this moment and what the movement is calling for is uncommon courage for our political leadership, and a very binary call, like which side are you on? And I think the way
looks like we lost Maurice there.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Can I jump in on this issue though? Maybe while we get Maurice back. Thanks. So I just want to say, I mean, I fully agree. And obviously we do a lot of work with Rashad and Color of Change, and a number of, we are on the ground in a number of communities with our policing reform campaign. LDF really believes, and I believe this, I've seen this across the span of my career, that it takes a multifaceted approach, right? So it is about, wholeheartedly agree with Rashad's comments around building power and the move, having different people in power. That absolutely makes a difference. But I also believe that policy has to change. The laws have to change, and that does make a difference. And the way that happens is for both efforts to work together to advance. And we've seen that throughout our history in terms of how civil rights laws were changed, that it was people coming to the movement through their orientation and lanes and pushing in the same direction, but in different ways. And that is what it's going to take in this moment. And I think that's what you're seeing in real time in this moment, in terms of this movement that's happening.
Thank you. Rashad, I know that you have to go here pretty soon, but I do want to quickly ask you something that I've learned from my generation, the generation of my younger siblings, is that young people are rethinking shame, that being ashamed does not have to be where the conversation ends, right? We should be uncomfortable having these conversations about race and racism and power, thinking of everything we've ever said to someone, right? How much of that shift in the rethinking of shame, the rethinking of all this, is responsible for how this movement has been able to kind of explode in a way we haven't seen before?
So, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? I mean, we published this report in January with USC Norman Lear School that didn't get as much attention as I would have liked, that looked at the crime TV genre, the sort of crime procedurals and the representation of race and the representation of crime and all the ways in which what we've been fed through corporate media, where you get these magical worlds of racial diversity, but racism doesn't seem to exist in those worlds. And white writers send justice through the mouths of Black and brown characters to kind of incentivize a system. We've seen all sorts of ways in which representation, right, and visibility hasn't led. And I think a lot about Gen Z and millennials, right, growing up in a world where they had a Black president. I grew up on Eastern Long Island in a community where I didn't have Black teachers really, or didn't have a lot of Black visibility, sort of except on TV and images. And every week we would get Jet magazine, and once a month we would get Essence and Ebony into our homes. And you would see the images of Black faces in high places, right? And you would look through it and think, like, what just happened this week in Black America? Or who are the great leaders in Black America each month? Or this person got a promotion, or this person just got the job with the mayor or the president. And you saw this, and this was the story, right, that was sold to us around what did it mean to get ourselves inside of systems and then work to change those systems from the inside. And it was a story, right, of working hard, of getting inside, right? Because even in our storytelling about how we talk about equality, and when I say we, it's not just our opponents, it's ourselves. We will say things like Black people are less likely to get loaned from the bank instead of banks are less likely to hire Black people. We will say Black people are less likely to get jobs in Silicon Valley instead of Silicon Valley has a history of systemically excluding Black people. So, and what I mean by this is, on one hand, we spend a lot of time fixing Black and brown people, right? Fixing Black people, mentorship programs for Black people to deal better with racist structures that have excluded us. We'd spend a lot of time financial literacy programs to help Black people deal with banks that from their very foundation have cut us out and prevented us. We talk about Black communities as vulnerable when vulnerability is a personal trait. Black communities have been targeted, attacked, and exploited. So I say all of this thing to connect to this point around shame, because I think it's incredibly important, is because we have spent a lot of time in words and language trying to fix Black people instead of fixing the systems and structures that have harmed and targeted Black people. And how do we actually have powerful movements that challenge those systems with a deep recognition that people watch as a Black president inside of office faced, even while we didn't agree with everything that he did at Color of Change and was oftentimes outside pushing, watch as he dealt with all sorts of indignities and push back and fight back to his policies that looked very different. And with a recognition that it's not simply about diversifying racist systems and structures, it's about challenging and dismantling those racist systems and structures. That is actually how we make good on the type of change that makes people's lives better, and not just on reforms that oftentimes can realign themselves because power and race and capitalism always has realigned itself in this country, even when we've had blips of success, Obama to Trump, poll taxes to voter ID laws, Jim Crow to mass incarceration, and the list goes on and on and on.
Rashad, thank you. I know you have to head out, but
thank you all very much. Great to be with you all.
Lisa, I want to go to you. The last few years feel like a new iteration of the civil rights movement, right? People are realizing that racism is no longer just someone calling you or I the N-word. It goes much further than that, right? Do you think the way that we're thinking about dismantling and anti-racism, do you think it puts more of an onus on all of us to be active in the destruction of white supremacy and the creation of an actually equitable society?
I do. I think, the movement and the dialogue that we are seeing, we certainly aren't there yet, and we need to see more of it, but that people are realizing the systemic nature of racism in this country. I think for a long time, people have been able to just sort of say, oh, that was your experience, but not recognize the systemic nature of racism, despite the fact that many of us have been lifting that up for a very long time in terms of policies and practices that have been put in place, to Rashad's point about, the access that Black people have to credit. That's based on policies of banks and quite frankly, in many instances, the federal government, and how, folks have access to financing and the ability to sort of have greater opportunity and do well. And so I do think that there is a greater awareness of that, but there needs to be an even greater awareness. And I think that's what's encouraging about what's happening in the country right now. I think people's eyes have been open. Certainly the immediate focus has been on police reform, but as we have this conversation about, everybody's so struck by this term of defund the police, but what much of the conversation is around reimagining what public safety looks like. And part of that conversation has to be about investing in communities so that people have the opportunity to thrive and do well. And to do that, you have to address these systems, these systemic racism that's embodied in many of the systems, so that everyone has equal opportunity and can do well.
Maurice, I want to ask you about the leadership of this movement. This seems to be a movement that is very diffuse, a lack of hierarchy, maybe by design. When people think of the civil rights movement of the 60s, it's obviously extremely, there were iconic leaders, right? MLK and Malcolm X, right? We associate the feminist movement of the 60s and 70s with, someone like Gloria Steinem. Maybe this is a failure on my own part, but I don't know who those people are right now. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that just that people haven't been paying enough attention? Tell us a little bit about leadership and movements and this moment.
Sure. And sorry for the technical problems we had earlier. It's the new new environment that we live in, where everything's by Zoom call. So, so in 2014, when the movement for Black Lives was birthed, and the movement for Black Lives is a part of a long continuum of the Black freedom struggle. And so we think about it in waves. So 2014 is a particular wave. We're experiencing another wave. We wanted to make a number of interventions around what leadership looked like. So we understood that in the past, people were used to a man, usually a preacher behind a pulpit in a suit, and usually there were singular figures. And what we know, if we've done any research, is that behind all of those men, behind pulpits, there were dozens and dozens and dozens of people and dozens of identities. So one of the interventions we wanted to make is to create a leaderful movement where a number of people who express a number of identities could hold leadership. So the movement for Black Lives is decentralized and coordinated. The other thing is we wanted to elevate organizing and organization. So I'm the national director of the Working Families Party. I'm also proudly an organizer, and I proudly represent the movement for Black Lives on this call. There are other people who are accountable to organizations and bases on the local level that are doing the work locally and aren't just talking heads that are symbolically sort of referencing a movement, but people who do the day-to-day work in LA or St. Louis or in Brooklyn or in Minneapolis. Those people weave together the movement for Black Lives, which is more than 150 organizations and leaders. And so this is deliberate. We're attempting to model a different type of leadership that invites other people where, and like you've seen, people who've hit the streets, they did not wait for permission, right? And we encourage that. Young people and other people not waiting for permission from leaders on high to articulate demands that we've been articulating for years. We think movements happen and movements are real when folks like us are learning every day about new people who are becoming adherents, and we're able to plug them in to the growing movement.
Lisa, this is an audience question that I think is so important to this conversation that we're having and the larger conversation people are trying to have in their homes and mostly in homes because we're stuck at home, right? Hopefully. The question is, quote, how can those of us who live in areas of little diversity learn to be more accepting and open when we never have to be?
So, I mean, we're also in the sort of internet age, right? And all of this information is accessible, right? And so this is a moment for all of us, regardless of where you lie in your racial identity, to take action, to learn. You know, a funny thing I saw was that maybe it was 2 weekends ago, the movie The Help was the #1 streamed movie. And, you know, to be very generous, what I feel like that is a indicator for is that there's a lot of people who are very curious, right? And, you know, there are all types of resources. So m4bl.org, which is the Movement for Black Lives website, you could go there. You could look at the resources. You could look at the very detailed Vision for Black Lives policy program, which expands beyond policing. And there's many organizations that are just really a click away in order to get that information. And we've seen already that in every single state in the country, there have been actions. And that includes states where there aren't a lot of Black folks. And we encourage that. And we think that there's an opportunity for non-Black people to take the initiatives to do the learning and to take the action on their own and not simply wait for permission or to expect Black folks to be the main educators when there's so many resources that are so readily available.
Yeah, I just want to say I agree with all of that. And I think particularly in the age that we're in and the fact that we're stuck at home. So now, you know, you have, you should be taking advantage of all this technology. There's an opportunity to learn, but I also want to say, I think there's a responsibility to have conversations among yourselves, that you should be having those conversations, those difficult conversations with your family members, with your neighbors, with, you know, the folks that you regularly interact with. So it shouldn't just take, you know, am I interacting with a person of color or I don't see, you know, a Black person in my neighborhood or on my street, but having that conversation with your neighbor is also going to help change this climate and culture overall. And so I would encourage folks to do that also.
All right, one more question, Lisa, for you from the audience. This is sort of a personal question. Someone's asking, do you have any suggestions on how to get people to listen without defensiveness and hear a point of view that is completely foreign to them? I think a lot of people are asking that kind of question. Any advice, Lisa? This is like, you know, you're,
wow. No, give that one to Maurice. No.
Okay.
So I think the moment we're in gives you the door to have the conversation, right? Because you can enter the conversation just as, a conversation about what's happening in the country right now. And to recognize that everyone may not be in the same place that you are, and enter the conversation, I think that way, still holding strong to truth and what needs to happen and what the history of this country is, but entering in a way that's not accusatory or possibly entering the conversation as a way for you to jointly think together how you can work to change things, I would say, perhaps.
Thank you, Lisa.
Been in defensive mode, so I'm used to being in that way, but I understand the need to have that conversation without being.
Yeah. Thank you, Lisa. We are running out of time, but this is one last question, and I'm going to pose it to each of you. Our producers are probably going to get mad at me, but people are feeling more anger, more fear than they have in decades. It's raw, it's painful and scary, I think, for a lot of people. I know I think about this a lot, to think about how much work we still have to do.
Sure.
So for the two of you, tell people who aren't trained as organizers, who may have just been, woken up to all of the atrocities that hit Black people in America. They don't know what to do with that, all these emotions. Tell them how to channel all of these emotions into something that can help move this movement forward and create that, equitable, equal society that we were promised.
Great. I'll start if you don't mind, Lisa. So
no,
that's what organizing is for, right? That's what organizing is for. Organizing is a vehicle to channel your time, your testimony, meaning your story, and your treasure, meaning your money, into action. And your passion and your unresolved conflicts, and many people are learning things for the first time and they're feeling rage. You channel that into action through organizing. And so, number one, identify an organization in your community or nationally, like the Movement for Black Lives, that is speaking to addressing anti-Black racism and challenging white supremacy. If there isn't an organization that meets your needs, work with others in order to organize that, in order to build that organization. There are young people on the streets that are building formations, that are doing direct actions that a few weeks ago were not activists. And so this is a moment to both join and to build new organizations and formations that address these things. But that tension and that anger it makes all the sense in the world when we're being confronted by such horrors like what we continue to see on video. And movements are places to channel your anger in order to build power, to transform our society. And so I invite people who are at home trying to figure out what to do with all these unresolved emotions to go into movement, to find organizations, to build organizations, to join the Movement for Black Lives, to text defend as defend in terms of defend Black Lives, defend to 90975 and plug themselves into the Movement for Black Lives.
And I would say, I agree with plugging into organizations that are doing the work. So I'll do the selfless plug of LDF and say, you should visit our website regularly, that you should visit our Twitter feed regularly. We are often talking about what's happening, not just in DC, but also in states and communities across the country. I'll say elected officials actually listen to you all. They listen to their constituents. And so many times LDF itself is putting out information for folks to actually reach out to their elected officials. Congress is getting ready to go on recess. They will all be at home. This is an opportunity for you to talk with your congressional members and make your voice heard about all of the things that need to be addressed. So the policing legislation, the COVID legislation, we are facing a huge eviction crisis with moratoriums on foreclosures and evictions that are sunsetting. And so we know in the next few weeks, we're going to see a huge onslaught of evictions. This is the opportunity for you to talk with your congressional members about why that moratorium needs to be extended. When we have 40 million people applying for unemployment insurance, that is an indicator that there's a need for economic support. And this is not a time for folks to get kicked out of their homes. So I would say lifting your voice. A lot of times people think it's the folks that work here in DC or work in your state capitals that are changing things, but actually electeds listen much more to their constituents. And it's really important for you to stay abreast of the issues that are happening and then to reach out to actually take action and reach out to them.
Good way to end. Lisa and Maurice, thank you so much. Maurice, sometime me, you, and Rashad will talk about all being from Long Island.
From where?
Wait, what city? What city?
Dix Hills.
Dix Hills. All right, Long Beach. So we're evenly spaced.
All three parts covered.
My husband's from Long Island, so I feel like I can join the conversation. There you go. My husband's from Freeport, so there you go.
Oh, wow. All right, that's a whole nother. Thank you guys so much. Thanks for the audience for joining us for part 2 of this virtual town hall, America at a Tipping Point. Again, thanks to Maurice Mitchell, Rashad Robinson, who left a little earlier, and Lisa Cylar Barrett. Before we wrap up, we're going to go through a few of the audience responses that came into our earlier question. What has encouraged you the most in recent weeks about how the US is tackling racism and race relations? A few responses we got. Here's one. The diversity of participants in the peaceful protests for change, along with increased corporate awareness of the problem. So that's one thing that an audience member thought was encouraging to them. Someone else said, seeing influential white people speaking up for Black lives and recognizing that racism is systemic and deep-rooted in our culture. Another response from someone in the audience, I appreciate conversations being had everywhere, with friends, with family, with professionals, with organizations, people using their platforms to support this movement and sharing ways to grow. I think that's one idea of how widespread this movement is that everyone, I know, I'm sure it's the same for you guys, is talking about this right now, whether they're interested in politics or not. It's the only thing on the minds of the public right now. Thanks again. Eugene?
Thank you.
When Political Live convened this town hall, we put out a call on social media asking all of you, what do you think needs to happen next to end systemic racism? Here are some of your responses. Thank you again, everyone, for tuning in on the live stream, for joining us. You can follow Politico Live on social media for more information on upcoming virtual programming and keep having these hard but important conversations.
The answer is pretty simple, actually. It is complete revolution, both political and economic. Ever since slaves were freed in 1865, things like sharecropping, redlining, war on drugs, privatized prisons have all kept people of color down and made Black essentially synonymous with poor. And we do that, and on top of it, divert resources away from poor communities and give them to police and military instead of education and welfare. You lower the ability even further for people of color to move forward in the world and create real change.
Now, while we should continue to protest the inequalities that plague our country, we must first reform our education system. Future middle and high school students must be taught about the blatantly discriminatory practices utilized by all 3 levels of government concerning housing, healthcare, and the criminal justice system against African Americans ever since the end of slavery. Only then will we have the ability to ameliorate the worst effects of systemic racism in the United States.
To be systematic, intentional, purposeful in achieving diversity in every institution.
You can challenge systems on many levels, get involved with groups working on criminal justice reform, challenge schools to look at their programs and policies with the assistance of experts within minority communities who can identify biases that impact minorities in the school, send your dollars to businesses that don't exploit minorities in their supply chains or local staff, And look around and ask questions at those places you patronize to ensure it's serving all people with the same level of access, dignity, and welcome.